And we are back on the Pirate Monk podcast. And a guest who I have wanted on this program almost since its very beginning. A fellow who I knew by reputation long before we met, but I knew from the moment we got together that we're brothers. Jeff Schulte from Tin Man Ministries is with us. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Nate. Good to be here. Yeah, whenever someone says my name and this has reputation, I get scared. I don't know what. I had probably one of the best things that was ever said to me. I was sitting in an elder meeting of a church that had taken me in about 10 years ago and was just loving me in some significant ways. And I had a young elder look at me, and we're kind of introducing around the room and to me to this eldership. Actually, it was at Lighthouse. Nate, you might be familiar with them over in Antioch. But this young guy looks at me and he goes, Jeff, he goes, I've heard about your great successes, and I've heard about your great failures, and I'm impressed by neither. He said, what matters to me is that your father is my father, which makes you my brother.
Oh,
and I went, bam. I have never had anyone say anything more significant to me. So, reputation, that's all over the place for me. Depends on who you talk to. But what I know is I'm glad to be on this podcast with you, because the way I put it to you the other day when we talked was, I just know we've been swimming in the same river.
Yeah.
And it's, or at least canoeing in the same river. Maybe I put it that way because it's kind of fun now in some ways to be in the same canoe with you, talking about how we can do some stuff together. It's very exciting to me, and I love this connection, chance to be on the podcast with you, but really more even to think about some of the ways that we are, like you said, doing some of the same things, care about some of the same things. And although our stories are different, they're really not all that different at all.
No.
Well,
our listeners need to know a little. Go ahead, Aaron.
Well, before we go on with Jeff's story, we have a man in the bottom right corner of the screen that is either a voyeur or purposefully on the show. You probably need an introduction.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. This is Joel Peters, who I ran into in a coffee shop at Starbucks, of all places. Oh, a couple of months ago, maybe.
Of all places, like it was so surprising you were.
Yeah,
Is that or a pub?
Yeah. The stranger said, "You're Nate Larkin, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he introduced himself. Joel Peters told me that he had started a Samson group in Seattle years ago and did it for 3 years, and that he was now here working with Jeff Schulte. So, hey, Joel, go ahead. Give us a thumbnail, brother, of how you got here to Middle Tennessee.
Oh man, here in Tennessee. Yeah, I was I led a Samson group for 3 years, and but I also was tracking with what Jeff was doing and Tin Man. And I knew Jeff 9 years ago in Alaska. That's where I met him. And I came to Nashville to be closer to it, be closer to him, and continue getting my heart back.
Fantastic. Well, brother, it's a privilege to have you here. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks.
I was going to say, I met Joel. He initially took me to coffee. He wanted to talk about, he was leading a singles ministry in the large church we were in together in Anchorage, and he wanted me to talk about singles ministry. And about 5 minutes in the conversation, I said, I think there's other stuff that we can talk about. And we sort of started getting past that into some real hard issues, and he became a brother that I have watched, a young man I have watched slowly with a lot of passion move toward getting his life back and living more wholeheartedly with his wife, with his kids, and with some other men. And I've watched God really has his hand on Joel's life with other men. And so, man, when he said, hey, Jeff, I'd like to come to Nashville and be closer to what's happening there, I said, well, we don't have a job and we have no money, but you're welcome to come. And he said, I'm coming. Put his family in an RV, sold his house, and brought his family across country, showed up in Nashville a little over a year ago and said, I'm here, let's just go for it. And so I love that he's on this podcast as well. And he's kind of in this journey with me with Tin Man.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Jeff, I remember, I think it's been a dozen years or so, and I heard that the hard-charging pastor of the most successful church in town had stepped down and porn was somehow involved.
Yeah.
I imagine if you're like me, you look back on that day and you realize God was saving your life. It was actually the best day of your life. But how did it feel at that moment? If you can remember, rewind.
Yeah. I'll go back probably. I'll go to August of 2005, and I had just come off a summer when typically I would take maybe a week or two off. That was about all I gave myself back then. Gave myself a week with my family, and typically that would be my recharge, and I would come back to hit the ground running for a pretty hard fall. And I was walking into that August, and it's a longer story about how porn had gotten involved about 2 years prior, but about a year and a half prior. It was 18 months, but I came into that fall realizing, one, I didn't have that gear that I'd always had to step in gear, but also there was this thing that was happening to me that had started about 18 months prior, where I had started looking at pornography, and so I was on this train that I couldn't get off of. And it was actually a train I got on way early, 8 years old, that had lasted up into my early 20s. But then in my early 20s seemed to have disappeared. And I thought it had. I thought God had answered a desperate prayer for me to ask him to take that away from me, having come to know Christ when I was 18 years old, freshman in college, and then the collision between my acting out behavior and my faith in Christ, and then those years of conflict where my relationship with God had always been determined by how I was doing, whether I was masturbating or looking at porn or whatever. If I was doing well there, everything was great. If I wasn't, it was all falling apart. And it all seemed to disappear and stayed dormant for probably 18 years. And really what I'd done, I had substituted one addiction for another. I'd moved from porn, which is a desire to be lusted after, for me at least, wanting to be wanted and desired, to I really found that in ministry, where I found that other people wanted me, desired me, and liked what I was bringing, and I was succeeding. But then it kind of popped its head back up again about 6 years into a 8-year window with this church that I planted here in Nashville that had gotten big real fast. But that summer, I remember realizing that I was terrified to tell anyone what was going on in my life. I knew that if I told anyone, I had a couple counselors I was working with, but no one at the church knew. If I told anyone there what was starting to happen with me, I would lose everything. I was married at that point 18 years. I had 6 kids under the age of 14, and I just thought I'll lose it all. And so this is a secret I have to keep while I try to work on it over here on the side. Problem is the keeping of the secret was part of the problem. But anyway, that summer I remember thinking I need to get out of here somehow. I was suicidal because I felt like this was crazy. I think about it now, but the only way to get out of the situation I was in was to go away. It wasn't to tell the truth. It was to go away. And so there were various ways I experimented with how to kill myself and was acting out on a couple of those plans. And it just got pretty tough. And finally, I went to the elder board that summer, and that August, and I just said, I either need to resign or you need to give me a sabbatical. But I cannot lead this church in the state that I am. And they said specifically, is it sexual? And I said, no. And that was not true. But I was just so afraid. And at that point, honestly, Nate, and Joel and Aaron, I didn't know where to go, what to do. All I knew was I was stuck, and I was on this train. I could not stop. And all the intellect I had, the good theology, the willpower, the hard work, the self-will, none of that was working to stop this thing that was happening in me, which was taking away any kind of life that I had. And so I was pretty desperate. I'd say desperate enough to think that the only answer to me was to kill myself. It was a pretty dark, I just remember being a very dark time. Fortunately, God did not leave me alone in that. And that's another part of the story, that I've never seen a man get out of a mess like that by himself. And fortunately, I didn't have to stay by myself, and I had some men come get me.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. And so you got to begin this recovery journey.
Yeah. Yeah. It didn't come easily. I still committed myself that I could get this recovery journey without telling the truth, because there were some things about my story that I swore I'd never tell anybody. I dropped in a grave. And so I was I admitted myself in a treatment center. And even there, I spent the first couple of weeks not telling the truth. I'm in a treatment center for sex addiction. I'm not telling them I got a sex addiction. I was just so, I have so much compassion for guys on this. I was just so afraid.
Yeah.
I just knew I was going to do everything. And I did, there there was a cost to some of what happened, but I gained much more than I lost in the long run with what ended up playing out. Yeah. But gosh, I was terrified. It was life terror. Enough, like I said, scared enough that I thought the only way I could get out of it with honor, quote unquote honor, was to burn my journals and kill myself. God forbid anyone read what I written in my journals.
So what happened?
They weren't Jim Elliott journals. I mean, this was like, yeah. I used to try to journal as a young follower of Christ, thinking, man, my grandkids are going to read these and know that Grandpa was a godly man, and that was a waste of time.
So what happened after you finally realized, okay, the truth needs to be a part of this? What were you surprised about as far as the responses, and how did certain parts go down just like you thought they would?
I remember Chip Dodd, who was one of the men that was a part of the rescue team that had dug into my life. I remember Chip saying to me, and I had this written on a 3x5 card on my mirror for 3 months that I was in a treatment center. And it said this, it said, if you tell the truth, those who want good for you will move toward you, and those who don't will not. If you tell the truth, those who truly want good for you will move toward you, and those who do not will not. And I'll tell you, the surprise was those who moved toward me, and the surprise was those who did not, because the ones that I thought would move toward me did not. And then there's some that moved toward me that I had no idea where they came from. And yet in that, and another thing that I remember, one of my mentors at the time, a pastor who's been a guy named Al Henson, who's been a godly man in my life. He was the pastor at the church where the young man said to me about your reputation. I remember Al Henson saying, you know, Jeff, the men that you wanted toward did not, but God did not leave you alone. Mm-hmm. He did not leave you alone. And so I was a man that had a million friends that realized I only needed a few. Mm. And the few that I had were all I needed. And there were some men that became closer than a brother. Some of that had to do with my capacity now to build relationships. But over the last 10 years, I've probably built the best friends I've ever had. And it's all been around my journey of recovery. And I would say part of my history would be what I mistook as intimacy was always intensity. Mm. And I learned how to be intimate, not just connected around intensity. You know, it's the foxhole intimacy. That's intense. We all become brothers in a foxhole, but we don't really know each other. And I learned how to really know each other, which really came from telling others the truth about me. And so when I started learning how to do that, it invited a kind of relationship that I had never had. And then, you know, I can tell you a quick story. I remember 2 months out of a treatment center. Now, you need to know, when I got out of that treatment center, I sat down with an elder board and I told them the whole truth. I said, this is everything that happened. They asked me any question they wanted to ask. There was some really grotesque detail. Some of the questions it was awful. Honestly, after I go through that, I still remember it very vividly. And I remember one question one of the elders said to me, he said, can you promise us you'll never do that again? Hmm. And I remember being, solidly 4 months into a process of recovery, like I was just a green baby at that point. But I did know enough to say this. I said, I cannot promise you I'll never do that again. What I can tell you is that I'm in a better place than I've ever been in my life. I've not acted out in any way today, don't plan to today, and I'm going to wake up tomorrow morning and ask for the grace of God to do it tomorrow. And that scared those guys because they wanted the assurance that they didn't have to be afraid that I'd ever do something crazy again. So it wasn't a good answer for them, but it was a good answer for me.
Make us feel better.
Yes, God.
Yeah.
Like bullseye. You know, and in retrospect, I probably could have been a little bit more deceptive. In the sense that they had no context for that kind of answer.
Right.
You know, well, nuance that, but I can tell you that coming out of there.
Pause there, Jeff. Pause there. Pause button.
What?
They had no context for that kind of answer. That kind of answer was simple truth. The men who were in charge of leading the flock had no context for hearing the truth. That just broke my heart in at least 3 places and was so true. Just wanted to point that out. Please continue.
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Darren. Here's the little story I want to tell. I remember, so I was publicly humiliated in front of the whole church, given 5 minutes to tell my story. Chip Dodd told me, he said, you tell everything, Jeff. He says, you tell every stinking detail. You say things that, there were some things they wanted me to say I didn't know if I agreed with, but he said, just say it. Just say everything. He goes, and then what will happen is no one will ever be able to say, well, if you only knew. Just lay it out there. He goes, Jeff, you're repentant. You're going to have to trust. He said, torch the mountain to see if something will grow from the ashes. And so I stood in front of the whole church one Thursday night, and I laid it all out. And, you know, I'd been fired and didn't know what I was going to do the rest of my life. I had this family. I had a limited health. It was just, I was terrified. But here's what I remember. I remember walking across, I can tell you where I was in my living room. I'm walking through my living room, and I literally stopped. It was like this moment where I was tasting. If you've ever been somewhere like exotic, someplace around the world where you taste the kind of food, there's a taste in your mouth, and you think, I've never tasted that unique taste before. Like something has crossed my lips, my palate, that I've never tasted that before. And I literally stopped. It was so unique inside my chest. I stopped and I said, what am I feeling? What is that? I have never felt this. Now, everything except my family and a few friends. I lost my church, lost my reputation, lost all the ministry I'd been in, anyway, there's a whole lot that came with that. Financially, it just tanked me. A lot of things happened. But I remember thinking, what is this? And it was joy.
Yeah.
And I went, that's joy. And I remember getting on the phone and calling Chip Dodd and saying, Chip, I think joy just happened inside me. And I don't know if I've ever sensed that before. It was that profound, and yet in the midst of incredible loss.
Yeah.
But they came together, if that makes any sense. They came together, and I didn't have one without the other.
Mm. Mm.
So tell me about, because I'm the guy in the dark here in this conversation. Yeah. Tell me about the 10-man ministry. What is that? How did that come out of this?
Well, so I needed to go. It's where it came out of. So at the time, here's where the name came from. At the time, I needed to work, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I'd been in vocational ministry my whole life. That was where my training and my experience and my passion had been. I didn't know what I was going to do because I'd lost my job and was told I would. At the time, it was pronounced that I would never be trusted in ministry again, and I was given the death sentence. And it was in writing, and I had to see it, and I had to hear it, and I had to embrace it. And so I needed to find some work, and there was a local media company that was growing very quickly, and I won't tell you how I got hired to help them some, but I needed to create an LLC, a consulting LLC, so that these people could pay me. And I remember I was standing down at the National Secretary of State for the state of Tennessee, and I'm trying to register for an LLC, and they told me I needed to make up a name. And I stood there for a minute, and I thought,